Hello, I am Paul Ingram, and Sahil here is part of the team of three of us. You've got the list there. I work for a centre studying the end of the world and all the different ways in which it might end and how we might try to mitigate that risk. Sahil will introduce himself later on when he stands up here, but also Ted, who's actually on the other side of the planet at the moment. He is a former US diplomat who used to represent the American government in workshops that I was organising around Europe to try to take the American nuclear weapons out of Europe and back to the mainland. We failed, he and I, but nevertheless, the relationship continued. Back in August this year, I was in New York for the NPT review conference, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we were attempting to, I say we, governments were there attempting to try to get agreement on how to regulate nuclear weapons and push for nuclear disarmament. They were doing that in the context of the Ukraine war, which was a massive shadow hanging over the proceedings, and in the end it failed. But on the 6th of August, the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, there was also in New York a presentation of awards to scientists who had been instrumental in discovering and then communicating the issue of nuclear winter, which we'll be talking about today. These are the scientists who got awards. One or two of them are dead. One, Carl Sagan, very famous for as a public communicator at the time, talking about the cosmos. I talked to his son at the presentation. He told me that of all the things that Carl Sagan did, and he's very famous within the public communications world, his work on nuclear winter was the issue that he was most proud of. This work came to the attention of the presidents at the time, United States and Soviet Union, and played a significant role in changing Ronald Reagan's mind about nuclear war, and drove Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev to double down on their efforts to achieve nuclear disarmament, which led to joint statements in 1985 in Geneva, and then 1986 in Reykjavik, talking about never fighting a nuclear war and attempting to get rid of nuclear weapons. So these guys and women had a big impact on the debate at the time. Since then, nuclear winter has kind of receded into obscurity, apart from a group of researchers who we'll be talking about in a minute. Yeah. This is the impact of the Hiroshima bomb. I'm not showing you pictures or slides of individuals who suffered. There were tens of thousands of people who died pretty much instantly. This event and the one 3 days later at Nagasaki had a huge shock influence on the war, of course, but also on the psyche of humanity. And what was so powerful was this idea that a single bomb could destroy, with its blast and its firestorms, a whole city in a single sweep. And of course, what came out in the weeks and the months later was the longer term effects of radiation, which, because it's silent and because it felt unclear and unknowable, was quite a symbol of fear. But the immediate effects are not the effects that we, Sahil and I and the team, are concerned about when it comes to the global impacts. And we'll talk about those in a second. This on the left is a very famous image of the mushroom cloud just a few minutes after the dropping of the bomb. The one on the right is less famous. It was taken several hours, 3 hours after the attack. And what you can see there with that cloud is the way in which all the dust and the debris that's been sucked up by the blast and the firestorms is rising up into the stratosphere. And it's going, you can see down the bottom here, images of land. This is a long, long, long way, many kilometers up into the atmosphere. And this is quite important for the effect that we'll be talking about. So you have a nuclear explosion. It sucks up this debris and throws it up into the atmosphere. And if you've had enough nuclear explosions, and this is the key open question that I'll come to, if you've had enough nuclear explosions, you have an accumulation of soot in the atmosphere, and that blocks out the sun. So you get very cold, very dry, and dark, and it also destroys the ozone layer. So you get a lot of ultraviolet light. And what that then drives, of course, blocking out the sun, massive temperature drops, crop failure, and lots of deaths. So that's the essential mechanism. Here are some of the models that scientists have in recent years been developing, and the results of the temperature that I just talked about, based on the amount of teragrams, these are millions of kilograms of soot in the atmosphere. And you can see it ranges from 5 teragrams to 150 teragrams, has a significant impact on the global temperatures. And some parts of the world have much bigger changes in temperature that then lead to direct deaths from the drop of temperature, and also crop failures, as I was talking about. This is the most recent significant paper that was produced by scientists in August, around about the same moment as I was in New York for the review conference. And that paper linked the amount of soot in the atmosphere with all the climatic effects, and then modeled the impacts on crops, and then the number of deaths caused. And I and my son have done an infographic that demonstrates the scale of this. So if you've got a limited nuclear war involving about 100 nuclear weapons about the size of Hiroshima, you get about 27 or so million immediate deaths from blast, firestorms, and radiation. 5 megatons or teragrams of silt in the atmosphere, dropping global temperature of 1.3 degrees, minus 7% crop failure, and about 225 million deaths from starvation over the subsequent 3 years. And you can see with larger nuclear exchanges going to total nuclear war, 4,000 nuclear weapons of about 100 kilotons, which is the rough average standard size nuclear weapon of today's modern arsenal, you have about 400 million immediate deaths, and then about 5 billion deaths, which is the vast majority of the global population. What we had a few years ago, 2018, was a response from Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory. A group of scientists there looked at the models that had been used and published by these scientists. And there were many academic papers that this one academic paper was responding to. And their conclusion was that if you have the amount of soot in the atmosphere that those scientists were using before, you would indeed have the effects that I've just described. So different sources of models, similar conclusions. So there's pretty much a scientific consensus here. What they did question, though, was the production of the soot and the amount of soot that went high up into the atmosphere and stayed there. The key thing here is that if the soot doesn't go right up into the stratosphere beyond the weather climate effects, then it can sit lower down and then get rained out quite quickly. And so the sun then comes through and the crops don't fail. So what they said was, in their models, the global effect was not achieved by a limited nuclear war. And this was the crucial thing, because they were looking at the first row that I was talking about. The response from the scientists, the original scientists, was that there were a number of problems with their models. They ignored secondary ignition, so that's things like gas pipelines exploding and other effects. The models that the Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory scientists used were modeled on line fires. So it's like a forest fire going in a line. Whereas what happens in a nuclear explosion is that you have these blasts and firestorms going out, and then mass fires set alight and then burning all over. So there isn't a line fire, and that makes a massive difference. Also, this was modelled on a low-density suburban area within Atlanta rather than in city centre, particularly in South Asia, where the original models were. So it's very different sort of what we call fueling. And they also used a dry atmosphere, so there was much less lofting as a result. They only had their simulations lasting 40 minutes. So there were significant problems. The original scientists had then published a couple of papers on the Canadian wildfires in 2017. Now, what you can't see because it's a bit small is that this is the altitude in kilometers of the above the fire, and this is the days roughly. Well, this is the 15th to the 24th of August 2017. So what this shows is that quite quickly the soot got 14 kilometers above the Earth, and it's carried on going up to around 20 or so kilometers above the Earth, way above the cutoff point that I was talking about. So this is a wildfire which is much lower in terms of its thermal effects, much less fierce than a nuclear explosion. And even in this case, you've got a situation where it's getting way up into the stratosphere and causing the effects that that all scientists involved in this have determined would lead to a nuclear winter. But what we have here is we have a debate. And when you have a debate, we need more evidence. I'm going to hand over to Sahil to talk about that now.
Thank you, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm Sahil Shah. I'm a specialist advisor to the Alliance of Pediatric Disasters, an honorary research fellow at the John Research Group, University of Madison, Wisconsin, an acting council member of the Scientific Council, and co-founder and director of Sustainable Community. So, based upon all of this, we have set up activities since the beginning of the Russian-Ukraine war, and it really stems around three different things. The first is on answering the scientific uncertainty. And we know where the scientific certainty where it sits in the air. We know with global climate models how much that reduces the temperature. We know with crop models how much that reduces yield, etc. parameters. But again, there's uncertainty. And there's unfortunately a lack of work that's been done in this area. Although those 8 scientists that were highlighted earlier have done fantastic work, there are very few other scientists in the world working in this for various reasons. And there can be issues in governments, especially a number of governments trusting the science, but it's coming from a small number of different universities. So one of the first things that we're doing here really is understanding how we can widen the scientific landscape, and how that can not just be from individual scientific institutions like the ones that have done the study, or like UCL, and how that can be expanded. So the Horizon study that Paul mentioned earlier was run out by the US National Labs, and there's a current study that's being run from the US National Academy, which is actually mandated to Congress. But unfortunately, although that will be presented in full to Congress, it's likely that a very limited amount of that will actually be made available to the general public and for scientific community can be done. But all of this work that can be done by the National Academy, it can be done by the UK Royal Society, and it can be done by scientific organizations around the world, facilitated by someone like the International Science Council, which is what we're looking at. And this is 2 really important things. Not only does it help buttress the certainty around some of the scientific questions, but it also adds institutional credibility. When we're working with policymakers, a lot of the time we get the answer, we get the question why, and we get, can we trust this? And having that kind of robustness when it comes to having national umbrella type of national umbrella institutions really gives us. And what these studies do is these studies are picked up in the press. So if we go back to the paper that Paul mentioned back in August, this study was actually picked up in everywhere in the UK from the Times, to the Sun, it was on the BBC, it made it in the United States Washington Post, It was even discussed on False News, and we were lucky enough to have Paul and Brian, two of the proponents of this, actually on TRT, the Turkish media network, and we were able to get both Brian to Alan Robot on Russia Today, Russia's main media network. It's fantastic. And all of this leads to public awareness. We're doing some more work on public awareness that I'll get to shortly. The next thing that we're working on and we're looking at is government resilience plans. So for a small number of countries in the world, they might be able to cause a nuclear war. There are a relatively small number of nuclear weapons possessing states. So there are a very large number of countries that would be impacted by it. And when it comes to this, it's imperative that these countries understand these risks that are out of their control. That when it comes to the impacts on critical infrastructure, it's not just the direct and blast radiation, but these global climate effects affect you whether you are anywhere from New York, which could be hit directly, right across to Timbuktu. And in that 5 teragram scenario that was spoken about, and the way it was modeled, the overwhelming majority of those deaths were in sub-Saharan Africa. Because when you have a falling crop output, you have increasing global prices. When you have an increase in global prices, it disproportionately affects the global south. And this is really important. And we happen to be in a moment where governments are finally waking up to nuclear risk. It's been said by numerous people, including Ernest Moniz, who was the US Secretary of Energy under Barack Obama, that the nuclear risk at the moment is at its highest since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The doomsday clock has us at 100 seconds to midnight, and will undoubtedly be higher the next time around. And for the first time, governments are interested in this. We've had the privilege and we've had the ability to have these types of conversations with government to help them understand how it might affect transport, how it might affect energy, how it might affect agriculture, not to take into account things such as a nuclear weapon detonated at altitude could cause something known as a high altitude electromagnetic pulse, effectively frying all electronics for a pretty large region. And it's not just nuclear weapons and nuclear war that could cause this. As Paul was saying around wildfires, you get a pretty similar phenomenon with major supervolcanic eruptions. So there are a number of different ways in which developing these resilience plans, both assessing the impact of infrastructure, and then also looking at how we might be able to build up resilience for you. And there are a number of different food production methods that are resilient to them. So when it comes to agriculture, agricultural crops get hit. The oceans get hit in a similar way, but fish are a fantastic alternative, at least in the first few months. And seaweed as a crop is one of the more promising solutions when it comes to what can be done to mitigate this weather. And the next part I want to touch upon is how all of this affects strategic. So the whole concept of nuclear deterrence is effectively wedded on the fact that nuclear weapons are so bad that they'll never be used, but they're a credible deterrent. So there are certain circumstances in which they might be used. There's been a lot of talk, for example, about Vladimir Putin detonating a tactical nuke over a rural area in Ukraine as a warning shot. However, a deterrent is only useful if it's credible. The effectiveness of the deterrent, as shown by climate policing, is how likely it is to be used, not how damaging it is. Now, let me pose you this question. If you have a nuclear weapon that can trigger a nuclear war, of which the number of explosions are highly unpredictable, and if you're a country like the United Kingdom or the United States, the fall in your crop production under that 150 teragram scenario is somewhere between 96 and 99%. It's not much better for China or Russia, slightly better for India or Pakistan, but it's still pretty horrific. Now ask yourself this, is that the kind of risk you would take? Would you use that nuclear weapon when you run the risk of starving your entire population? But the answer is probably no, which renders it a non-credible deterrent. But there are options. Like we've seen emerging technologies over the years, everything from autonomous weapons with AI to offensive cyber weapons that could be used. And most interesting, precision weapons, the nano weapons that could be used. And with a lot of these weapons, we're able to precisely target military infrastructure without affecting civilian infrastructure. We're able to achieve military objectives without causing war crimes. And when it comes to these options, basically we have a much lower barrier to use. there are situations in which we're willing to use these and which we're not willing to use nuclear weapons, creating a much more credible. This is the type of public discussion and private discussion that we want to have. And speaking about public discussions, that brings us back down to opinion polling and some of the work that's being run out of CISA through the project that they're running here. And for the most part, I'm sure as many of you know, when it comes to foreign and defense policy, the general public is relevant. These matters are seen as highly complex, and they're seen as the purview of diplomats, senior civil servants, ministers, without the general public weighing in, as we have seen in numerous wars ranging from Iran. How do I get that? What?
Oh, sorry. Oh,
So actually, with an opinion poll.
you're on the opinion
Yeah,
poll.
thanks. So we're running a poll, which will be run in the upcoming days, and we should have results for the next couple of weeks. And what this focuses on is, well, what it starts to do is it looks at awareness of nuclear risk. So there was those born and who were raised in the Cold War that almost certainly have a much better knowledge of nuclear winter, and there was the Protect and Defend, Protect and Survive campaign that was run by the British government. However, I'm sure there are many of you in the room, like myself, who were born after the end of the war, to which all of this was foreign. And I'm sure to many of you, this may well be the first time you've heard of nuclear winter. But the first thing when it comes to understanding this is what actually is public awareness. Who has heard of nuclear winter? How much they know about nuclear winter? How do the various and how can this shift into public education? Because public education and an informed public and an informed electorate are really important to hold governments. And then what we're doing from that is we're saying, based upon what people know about nuclear winter, how does this actually change their support for nuclear weapons? So a lot of polling has been run by Scott Sagan from Stanford University and a number of other academics that basically look at support for nuclear weapons, support for these. But it critically doesn't inform the public of what all of this entails. So we're looking at running a dual poll, which would look at support and isolation, and then it would inform another group, a non-control group, and see how that changes. We would look to understand how and why this changes, because it could be for a number of reasons. It could be because they're concerned about themselves, the impact on their own risk. It could be for global humanitarian reasons, or it could be something else entirely. And we're then pairing this with contextualizing, because what we all know is we are in the middle of a hot war. The level of nuclear risk is the highest that it's been roughly 60 years ago. And there are dangers associated with nuclear brinkmanship. There are real dangers of not taking nuclear threats seriously, of escalatory rhetoric being used, of escalatory military action being taken. And once a nuclear weapon has been used, once a nuclear taboo has been broken, it's very difficult to know where that is. So what we're now doing is we're looking at a particular scenario in the Ukraine, which you'll find out more about once everything is published out in the public domain. And we want to see how that changes how the public would react and respond to that scenario. Because yes, it's imperative that Ukraine is supported, but at the same time, there is a fine balancing line that we do not run the risk starting. And after that, we're really looking at certain activities that build upon it. Because running a one-off poll is great. It informs the government, but we can do a lot more than that. There are three things that I mentioned. We have science, communication, we have study. We have the public awareness and public communication, but then we have policy maker, and we have policy engagement. So a lot of what we're really looking to do after this, and what we're really looking for assistance for, is actually an engagement in the latter, in the third of it. We're looking for people to help us better understand some of the political pain points, punch points, the areas in which we can engage policymakers where they really care about things. The narrative that we're able to craft, that we're able to create, that will resonate with policymakers. The way in which we're able to combine public awareness and public opinion, and how public awareness shifts public opinion with how policymakers, especially the political ones who really care about public sentiment, respond and react to this, and how it changes their actions, not just in the middle of war and foreign policy, but also looking at longer term effects. both when it comes to nuclear, but also when it comes to non-nuclear. And that's something that if anyone here is interested in assisting us in working with our team, we would be very appreciative of having a chat with either one of us after this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to rapidly take you through nuclear deterrence theory before questions, because I'm really keen to get to that. But nuclear deterrence is about balance of terror. And it's based upon an aggressor's rational perception. So we are currently making calculations around what we think President Putin is thinking, and he's doing the same in the other direction. In order for nuclear deterrence to work, you have to have a situation where the benefit to the aggressor from their aggression and the probability of those outcomes happening needs to be less than the damage to the aggressor from your nuclear response and the probabilities of your nuclear response, all in the mind of the other person. And this is crucial because that opponent needs to believe that you are credible and ready to do this. There's some complications in all of this, of course. One is that this actually is a post hoc justification. Nuclear weapons actually arose out of a war and a war fighting mentality. And many people within the defense ministries are still involved in thinking about these weapons basically as very, very large bombs being at the end of a process. And what they are involved in is what they call an escalation ladder. So they need to have dominance over their opponent on every level of the escalation ladder. And when you're looking for dominance at that level, it means that you're engaged in an arms race, which spirals out of control. You've got the problem of miscalculation, miscommunication in war. You've got issues of uncertainties and signaling, so that you feel you need to send a stronger signal than you might otherwise want to. You've got a number of biases and heuristics, rules of thumb, which punch holes in this rational choice theory. And you've got situations of overconfidence arising from the belief that the opponent is self-deterred. You've certainly got that in this current situation where President Putin appears to think that the West is not willing to stay the course. This arises from a belief in the unequal moral qualm, or a belief in unequal attachment to the status quo or what might happen. In the extreme, some of you may have heard that there's rumors of President Putin suffering fatal illness at the moment. If that's true, if it's true, and that's a big if, it means that he may be less attached to existence than the rest of us, which is a real problem when it comes to deterrence theory. And last but not least, you've also got the emergence of new emerging disruptive technologies, which make things very unstable and very uncertain, and the nuclear command and control being much less reliable, potentially. Then, with the added nuclear winter complication that we've been talking about, as Sahil says, even limited nuclear war destroys civilization, which is a real problem for the escalation ladder. It means that there is self-destruction from use. So even if your opponent doesn't respond with nuclear weapons, you may still suffer for a mass starvation from your own nuclear explosions. And by implication, that undermines the credibility of your willingness to threaten or use nuclear weapons. And so it heightens the gamble. What you have classically is a cartoon where two people are in a room soaked with gasoline, about a foot deep, with two matches, and one of them threatening to light the match and the whole room going up. It is a mutual suicide pact. And I've got a load of observations to the nuclear deterrence debate, but we've run out of time, so I'm not going to go there. And I'm not going to go to a systems perspective. But what I want to finish with is this question, which I think is a question that's overarching, on not just on nuclear weapons, but on existential risk itself, that all of us need to be putting our minds to, which is that we are in the middle of a revolution, a set of revolutions, driven by the way in which we are living our lives, be it trying to achieve stability between states through nuclear deterrence or the consumption of carbon or whatever. And we need to be thinking very much about how we as academics can contribute not only to the evidence, which is important, but also doing things that like Sahil and I are doing, which is how you communicate that evidence, how you do so in a way that is actually draws people into a process that is open-minded and not closed, because it is closed-minded approaches. And I don't just mean from one side of the debate, that means we don't progress. So science and academic progress requires openness.